Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Today's session, I'm going to be taking you through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in, or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. And this screen is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And it's going to list all the clients that you've added in. So to add a new client, you're going to go up to this add button. And the key things when adding any clients are going to be first name and last name. So let's call our client Ben Collins. You can put in a middle name too, but it's not required. The email field is there if you're going to be sending the client the online questionnaire. So you put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire box, and then when you added them to the system, it would send them off an email that would say, click here to access your questionnaire. So once they clicked, they'd be brought to a page where they have to make a password, just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to complete it all in one sitting. They can come back and log into it at any time. And then they go through and enter in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire is going to automatically populate back into your account. So it can save a lot of time with manual entry if your clients are tech savvy. But you don't have to send them that questionnaire. So you can use whatever process you use now, whether that's sending them a Word document or a PDF document questionnaire and having them fill it out, and then you could enter the information on your end. Or you could just be going through it through them, or going through the whole file with them by a screen share, like what we're going to do today. So it's up to you. You either put in the email and click that use questionnaire box, or you don't, and then it won't send them a questionnaire. The contributors thing down at the bottom, this is just if you have multiple users on your account and they're not all admins, then you can pick and choose who has access to the file. Whoever's marked as this primary contributor, if you're choosing to do a cover page when we go to generate the document, then this is the name that will appear on the cover page. Then we'll go ahead and add. So since today we're doing a spouse client file, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. If you're just doing one person's will and they have a spouse and they're going to be a beneficiary, then you just need to add that person into the system as a client, and you can add the spouse as a person on their family tree. But this is if you're doing wills for both of them, then you have to add them both as separate clients to the system, and then we can link them together using the spouse client function. So we've added Ben. Now let's go ahead and add his spouse. So we'll go back to the add button. First name, last name, so Lauren Collins. And the key trigger here is this spouse client function. So you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse to the system. So you're just going to click on it and then pick the first spouse's name from the drop-down list. So you can only do this on the second one just because the first one has to already be in the system in order for you to be able to pick them and then link them together. And by doing this, any of their shared family tree or joint asset information is automatically going to populate in both of their profiles. And then as well, any of the scenarios that are going to be the same, as well as appointments, you're going to be able to manually sync it over. So I'll show you that a little bit later, but it can save a lot of time, especially if it's going to be close to a mirror will situation. So we'll go and add. So now Ben and Lauren are both in the system, and you can pick who you want to start with. So today I'm going to pick Ben, and you just click on their name and it'll bring you into their profile. And if it's a spouse client file and we've linked them together with that spouse client function, you're going to start with the client and the spouse. And usually what I like to do first is edit the client's information. And there's two ways to do that. You can click on edit, or you can double click on the client's icon or the icon of the individual that you want to edit. That's what I usually do. And the key things for information wise, you're going to want to make sure first name, last name, and gender is in there, just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. Also known as, you can put that in. Ben's also known as Benny Collins. That will populate in the will if you put that in that field. Date of birth, you can pick it from the calendar or you can just type it on the line. So maybe it's March 6th, 1960. Country of birth, you can pick your country, you can pick your citizenships, you can do multiple citizenships. All of this information, this is good to have on your file for the client, but it doesn't really have an effect on the generation of the will. Residency, this is important because however you set the province as here is how the system's going to know to calculate the probate tax throughout. But most importantly, if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, you've got to change the province here to make sure it generates the right precedent for your province. So if you're from Nova Scotia, you change it to Nova Scotia, and then the Nova Scotia precedent would generate. But the default is set to Ontario. The city is also another important field. If you want it to say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto in the will, then make sure that city field is filled out. Special circumstances. This is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues the client might have. So you just mark it off, and then you could write a description in the box below. So this is good information to have on file, especially if you believe there might be a will challenge down the line. You want to make sure this stuff is really well documented. And then the last thing is just direct relationships. And it's just going to tell you who they're tied to on the family tree. So right now it's telling us that Ben is married to Lauren. Then we'll go ahead and save. So let's say that Ben and Lauren have some kids. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. And to get the blue circle around someone, you just click once on their icon. If you double click, it's going to bring up their information. So you click once and then you go up to the add button and select the relationship. So I'm going to say child. Whenever you're adding a child, you're going to get this prompt. So it's going to ask you who the other parent is. Is it the current spouse, Lauren? Is it a new parent, so an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will? Or are they a single parent? So either they're genuinely a single parent or there's an ex-spouse, but they're not going to be involved in the will. Let's say today it's Lauren. And then you can enter the child's information in. So we're going to call him John Collins. Let's say he's male. And put his date of birth, June 8th, 2000. And then the special circumstances section, this is a place where you can note down relationship difficulties, that kind of stuff, which is good for your documentation. But most importantly here is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure that disability button is clicked off, because then the system's able to recognize this individual is disabled. And then if you draft a trust later on that's fully discretionary to the death of the beneficiary, then it's going to draft a Henson trust clause in the will. So you need to make sure they're marked off as disabled here if that's what you're trying to do. And then we'll go and add. If you look at your add list, you might notice that there's no option for grandchild or niece and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationships. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, what you have to do is add a child to Ben and then click on that child's icon to get that blue circle around them and add a child to the child. Let's say he's a single parent. And that's how you'd get the grandchild in. Let's say Lily. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. So what you would do is you'd click on Ben, you'd add a sibling to Ben, then you'd click on the siblings icon and add a child to the sibling. If there's going to be anyone else involved in the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, but they don't fit on the family tree, either because they're not family or they're so distant that you don't want to build out the entire family tree just to get to them, you can go over to this other tab here and add them in here. That way their information will be in the system and you'll be able to choose them later on when you're planning. So let's say Jordy's going to be involved in this will. Let's say he is a friend. So that is sort of the people section. Does anyone have any questions about the people section or anything so far? You can feel free to just unmute yourself or send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier. Nope. Okay, we'll keep going. So the second thing that you get to is assets. And you're always going to start with these general personal effects asset, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will because it triggers a special general personal effects clause. So on the asset tab, there's a couple of different ways you can approach it. So if you're really doing an estate plan and maybe it's a high net worth client, you really want to give them a sense of the value of their estate at this point in time, you can add in all of their assets with all the values and really get a good sense that way. But if you're just doing a really simple will, where it's like everything to spouse, everything to kids, you're just dealing with the residue, you don't need to add in every single asset. The only assets that you do need to add in here are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or registered assets that you want confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. So you just click on this add button and then you pick your category of asset and then you pick your type. So let's say we're going to do a bank account. And when adding any asset, you're going to want to make sure that asset name is how you want to identify it throughout the system and in the will. So if I'm adding like 5 bank accounts and they're all called bank account, that could be confusing even if I'm not doing a specific asset bequest. So I want to change it to maybe call it the RBC bank account number, whatever that number is. And that way I'm going to be able to differentiate this bank account from the CIBC savings account. If you put the balance in, you're going to notice that that probate tax gets automatically calculated for you. And it's based on whatever you've set the client's residency as. So we set it as Ontario, so it's calculating it according to Ontario law. And then we'll go ahead and add in the bottom corner. Next, let's say we're going to do a home. So we'll go add on home. For the asset name, you can change it. Maybe it's the family home, maybe multiple homes. If you're putting in the address, this will populate in the will if you're doing a specific asset bequest. The current value, it's again going to calculate that probate tax for you. And if there is a mortgage on the property and you know the value of that mortgage, I would put it in this mortgage/encumbrances field here, because not only does it have an effect on how much probate tax is calculated, but it's also good to know what asset this debt is associated with. When we get to the next section, debts, you're going to also have the option to add a mortgage in there. But if it is associated with an asset that you're adding into the system, I would add it in this field here instead. The one thing you want to make sure is just don't add it in both sections. So don't add it in as a value in here and as a separate debt in the debt section, because it will double count it. So best practice, if it's associated with an asset that you're adding to the system, just put it in this field here and don't add it again in the debt section. For ownership, let's say it's a joint ownership, so you can change that, and then you just click right on this add owner text and you can pick whoever the other joint owner is. So let's say it's the spouse. And now when we add this asset to the system, this family home will also be appearing in Lauren's lists of assets as well, because we link them with that spouse linking function. Let's do one more. Let's say we're going to do an Rrsp. Again, I would change it so it's identified in the asset name, especially if you're adding in multiple. The beneficiary field, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy, so it's just for information purposes. Later on, you're going to be able to decide whether you want to change that beneficiary and do a new designation, or whether you want to confirm that beneficiary in the will. Let's put a value. So that probate tax always calculates automatically, but the income tax doesn't. And that's just because due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what we usually do is we do an estimate of it, and we try to estimate on the high end, so sort of the highest possible tax they could incur. So for something like an Rrsp, we'd put in like 50% of that. For something with an asset that has a capital gain, we would do like 25% of that gain. just so that you have a value in there. But again, when you're adding assets, you don't need to put in any values. This is more for the planning part of things. So are there any questions about the assets section? Nope.
Hi, Michaela.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So my question is kind of about the assets section, but it's also kind of about the initial screens when you're setting up the clients. So I usually just set up the one client. So I put the spouse in first, and then I set up the client as the one I'm going to send the questionnaire to, and I only send one. But where in here, if there's something that's a sole asset of the spouse, would that come in, or do I need to send the questionnaire to both?
So you don't need to send the questionnaire to both, but you need to add them both as clients and link them together in the system in order for the one to enter the other's solely owned assets as well.
So I did take a look at that, but I couldn't see, is that in the questionnaire that I don't see? I couldn't see where it showed up in the client file.
It should be in the question. So if you have linked them together and let's say Lauren or Ben has added in some of Lauren's solely owned assets in his questionnaire, you'd be able to just go into Lauren's profile and see her solely owned assets that he entered in. So when he's adding them in, there's going to be like a field where it says ownership, and he should be able to select Lauren as the owner, as long as you've added them both as clients to the system and linked them with that spouse client function.
Can you show me here how to add an asset of I think Ben was the main client that you sent it to? How do I enter an asset of Lauren's here?
So instead of adding it in as Ben's profile, you would just switch over to Lauren's up here in the, you just get to switch right over here. And this will appear as long as you've linked them together. And then you just go in and add, let's say she has a bank account, it's solely owned, and you could just add it in. And so now the bank account will be in here, but it wouldn't appear in Ben's.
So I had a client just 2 days ago request that I also send the questionnaire to their spouse so they could enter their assets. So I guess they didn't do it when they were filling out the original. So do I have?
Did you add them both as clients into the system and link them together with the spouse client?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so sometimes it's not the most obvious. If they click on their little question mark in the top corner of the questionnaire, there should be a section on how they can change it when they're linked together and add in their spouse's asset. But you could either send the questionnaire to the other client if you wanted. You can send it to both of them, or you can just ask that one client to go back into their questionnaire. So all they have to do is log into eState with the email and the password that they created when they started the questionnaire. And then they can go back to the assets section and add in the spouse's assets as well.
And it doesn't matter which way that gets done?
No.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. So that's the assets section. So the next section is debts. And with the debt section, it's more for planning. It has less of an effect on the will. Since we already added the mortgage in, we're not going to add it in again here because we don't want to double count. But let's say there's a credit card. So we'll put in the credit card debt, maybe it's $5,000, and we'll add. So then we get to the scenarios section, and this is where all of the planning occurs. So at most, you plan for each of these 3 scenarios so that you're covering your bases no matter what happens. So you'd start with surviving spouse, and you'd go into it, and you could start manually filling it out. But what I'm going to show you today is e-plans. So if you click up on this little lightning bolt up in the top corner, it's going to give you a bunch of e-plans, which are basically macros that go through the system and fill out all the scenarios and appointments according to whatever it's set out, whichever e-plan you're choosing. So let's say, and you usually use it for typical situations. So if it's kind of like everything to spouse, everything to kids, and then everything to half to siblings, half to spouse's siblings, you click on it, it will run through and do that for you. But you're not locked into it or anything. It's just a great starting point. So let's say I wanted to do this one, this surviving spouse, everything to the spouse, then everything to the kids in this trust with 50% at 25, the rest at 30. But I didn't want to do that exact trust. I wanted to go the kids, so I might make some changes to the trust. And then in the no descendants, I'm going to want something else. But I'm still going to run this e-plan. So it gives me that foundation, and then I can go in and change it after. So I'm going to click on it. And now when I go into the first one, it's not empty anymore. It's already been filled out. So the joint designated assets, anything that's been marked as joint or designated to the spouse, it's going to be automatically gifted, so it knows it's falling outside of the estate. In the initial gifts, the general personal effects are going to go to the spouse, so you're triggering that special general personal effects clause coming up in the will. And then for the balance of the estate, it's going to give everything 100% to the spouse. So I don't need to make any changes to this scenario. This is good. This is what I would want. So then I can go to descendants only, and it's going to gift those initial gifts to the children. But let me show you how I would do it if I had to do it manually, just in case. So anything here, you're just going to grab your asset and drag it over. And then you just click right on the beneficiaries line and you pick your beneficiary. So you can name the children specifically, or you can scroll down and you can use the class of children. And then for the balance of the estate, it did this trust. So you just click on the gray bar twice and it's going to show you the details. So the beneficiaries are the children. It's 100% amount divided equally between them. The trustees are the same as the executors. The duration, I want to change this so it's till 25 instead. And for staged lump sums, I want it to be at 21, I want them to get 25%. And then the gift over is first to beneficiaries issue, and then if not, to other class members, the other children. Then we'll save. And so now it's saved as that trust that I wanted to do, not just the trust that we ran with the e-plan. And because I made a change to this, I'm going to want that change to be reflected in Lauren's will as well. So I just click on Lauren's name up in the top corner, and then I press sync. And it's going to copy everything I've done here over to her profile. It's the only thing it won't copy over is solely owned assets. And the one thing to note there is sometimes the system sees the general personal effects as each of their solely owned general personal effects. So you might have to then go into Lauren's profile and gift her general personal effects after. So that's descendants only, then no descendants. So that e-plan gave half to the siblings and half to the spouse's sibling, but I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to clear it and I'm going to start from scratch. Let's say I wanted to give half to Jordy and half to a charity. So I'm going to create two segments. I'm going to divide up the residue into two, and then I have to create gifts within those segments to specify what I'm doing with it. So I'll start with segment 1 for 50%, and then I'll add a gift. So I'll pick Jordy, 100%. So this means 100% of the 50%. So I'm not dividing it up even further. And then let's say gift over to his issue. Then we'll add. So now I've dealt with everything in this 50% segment. So I don't need to add any more gifts here because I've dealt with it all. What I have to do is go back to segments. So this grayed out segments button up here. And I need to add another segment to deal with the other 50%. So I'm going to go segment 2 for 50%. And then I'll add a gift. And if you've already added the charity to the system, you can just scroll down to the bottom and pick it. But if not, you just go to the 3 dots and you can enter in a new charity. So I'll say Epilepsy Toronto, and if you have the CRA number, you can put it on the line. If not, you don't have to, but just don't put it in the ID field because it won't populate anywhere. And then we'll just go and add. And if Lauren wanted this too, we'll copy it over to hers with that spouse sync button. So that's scenarios. Are there any questions about scenarios or e-plans? Okay. So then we'll go to appointments. And this is where you're going to put in your estate trustees and your guardians if you need to put your guardians in. So the e-plan that we ran is going to automatically put the spouse as the primary appointee. But let's say we wanted to add an alternate. So you just click on the add button, and then you click on appointee, and then you can choose a condition. So if you wanted them to also be a primary, you'd select none, because none always makes them a primary. If you want them to be an alternate, you can pick a condition. Usually I pick if all specified cannot act. And so this is going to say Lauren, if Lauren can't act, then Jordy. And you can add further alternates, joint primaries, just by playing around with the condition. And the spouse sync button is actually in the bottom left corner for the appointments and the POAs. So you can just sync it and it will copy it over to Lauren, but it'll change her and Lauren, or her and Ben's name so that she's not her own primary trustee. Then provisions. So there's a couple of things here. The first is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can type them on that line. But if not, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members as if you are using class gifts in the will, like we gifted those general personal effects to the class of children. Here we get to pick and choose whether we want future members of that class included in the definition. So if I click it, it's going to say my children are John and any other child born to me and Lauren. But if not, I could just make sure that it just includes John. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age is your general trust clause for underage beneficiaries that you haven't set up specific trust for in the will. So you can change the duration if you want. You could even put in an interim partial distribution, but you can also just leave it as 25. And it's not going to affect any trust you've set up in the will. It's only for underage beneficiaries, maybe like a grandchild through a gift over that doesn't have a trust set up. And secondary will assets, that's just if you're doing multiple wills, so primary and secondary corporate, then you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. And if you're not doing multiple wills, you don't have to uncheck or check anything. It won't have any effect. Then up in the corner, these are what we call advisor insights. And it's almost like a contextual checklist that's constantly advising you based on what information you put on the system. So it'll advise you of certain things you've missed, like I didn't put in a gender for mine, so it's telling me if I go back and change that, I should do that before generating the will. And this advisor alert would go away. But not all of them do. Some of them are just there to make sure that you've thought about it and they won't disappear. So it has no effect on the generation of the will, it's just for your knowledge. The next thing is notes. So if you wanted to make any notes on the client, you could type them in here, like maybe you wanted to check on the spelling of a name or confirm that you had done a title search. You could type that in and it would appear at the end of the text summary. And then the last button is documents and summaries. So this is where you generate everything. First of all, there's 3 summaries. So the first is the profile, and it's going to give you a PDF of all the information that the clients filled out in their questionnaire or that you filled out for them on their behalf. So it's got profile information, family tree information, asset information, and debt. Then the second one is the graphic scenario summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. And if you're putting in values, this is when these things come in handy because it sort of shows you what's in the assets and what you're losing through debts and taxes and initial gifts and what ultimately is in the residue at this point in time. And then lastly, you've got your text scenario summary. So it's going to have all of your estate trustees, your gift information, your residue breakdown. It's almost like the will without the legalese. It's just got all the details in a more digestible format for the client. So those are summaries. Then we'll go to documents. If you're on a trial, you can just ignore this message. You're not going to be charged anything. But if you're not on a trial and you're on the flex plan, this is when you would be incurring the fee for this client when you generate your first document or summary. So we're going to click single will today. You can always change the signing date, or you can take it out completely. It's up to you. The registered asset designation, this is if you want to include or to do a new designation of the registered assets in the will. The joint designated asset confirmation, this is if your client has a lot of joint assets with adult children and you want to confirm that all the assets that are joint are truly joint, not to be held on a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice little chart at the end of the will that guides you to the clauses in the will. And a cover page is a cover page. The witnesses, you can pick anyone else who's a user on your account, or you can pick this blank box and then you can manually put in their information in the will. And then you just click generate and it's going to give you a Word document that's fully editable, so you can make any changes that you want. I'll just go through it briefly. So funds and plans, this is if you click the registered asset box and you've gifted something in the joint designated assets section in the scenarios. This is the assets passing outside of the will, so the joint asset box you clicked off. Here are all your definitions. So here's my children. Because we clicked the future children box, it'll say my children means John and any other child born to Lauren and me. Here's our appointments. Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy. Here's our funeral arrangements. Here's the personal effects. And sometimes you're going to get this red highlight, and that's just because whenever you gift it to children, here you have to decide whether you're just going to leave the division of those personal effects up to the trustee's discretion, or if you're going to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that. So you can either take out everything after the or, so take out A, B, and C after the or you can leave it in. Residue, so we have it to Lauren. If not Lauren, then the children in this trust we created, and then ultimately half to Jordy, half to the charity. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, here's our fancy dancy will guide that guides to the clauses in the will. And that's how you'd go through it. Then you would ideally switch over to Lauren's, go through everything just to make sure she didn't have any changes in her will. Make sure her general personal effects are gifted, and then you generate hers as well. And one other thing I want to point out is this question mark. So up in the top corner, if you click on the question mark, it's going to bring you over to our help desk. And this is where you can search for things like, how do I do a Henson trust? So it's going to tell you first, make sure you mark them off as disabled in the people section. And then when you're creating the gift, do so with unlimited discretion and set the duration as the death of the beneficiary. And then it will draft that wording. So all sorts of questions. It should give you step-by-step, and it could be really helpful. But of course, if you're stuck, you can always email me, and I'm always happy to answer your questions or jump on a Zoom and help you through it. So before we wrap up, does anyone have any other questions about anything? Nope. Okay, well, don't hesitate to reach out if you do. I'm always here to help. And thanks everyone for joining me today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.